Testar aqui o microfone. Deixa eu ver se tá funcionando.
Front, left, front, right.
Tá bruto. Aí eu vou fazer o seguinte, vou deixar só um microfone.
Isso, é. Ooh,
Uh-oh.
be careful. Ooh, look at it.
There's
Okay.
lots of people on the line. Just a fun.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. The
Like
camera's
this, or-
confused. It's cool.
Hey there.
Hi. Hi.
Why don't you sit down and I'll adjust it for you?
Oh, that makes sense. We even have a camera, like person,
A camera person?
cameraman,
Technician?
technician.
Yeah, I
Oh,
don't usually
yeah.
need to change the angle, yeah. Are you going to join on Zoom on your laptop as well?
No. You guys good?
Yes.
I will do that as host.
Yes.
You can.
So where are the slides going to be on?
Hi,
Slides
Camila.
are here on the desktop.
Oh, they're on the desktop. Okay, so I can, so that's what we can use to click through the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
That one. And then Alejandra can let us know if there is a question.
Sure.
And we can read it from this one.
You should probably just disconnect your audio so that it doesn't.
No, it doesn't need to be at all.
So you have all the slides there?
Yes.
Those are the only slides?
Yes, this is the only thing we are doing.
There were three
We are
slides.
doing announcements. That's it. This webinar is going to be an
Only
announcement.
announcements.
Exactly. Are the other ones open?
Yes.
Okay, there's more. So you need to share the screen then. Before you.
It's coming up.
Yeah, I'm seeing it.
Who will be presenting first?
I'll be doing the announcements and then Anna will be presenting after that.
Okay, so it's recording.
I will do that. Can we do
Screen sharing.
Other new.
¿Qué?
Ellos no se conectan de acá de mandar.
Alejandro, nos falta mucha gente. ¿Tú crees? Me faltan argentinos. ¿Y Natalia? Is the mic?
Yes.
Venga. Okay. And there are 4 people without audio.
I think this will work.
People are in the room together.
So
but
just
they
volume
had
we
something
can
on
just
Zoom, so
Oh,
they
okay.
didn't want to join.
Good.
Sorry, did you say some, are we supposed to do something with this?
No, just to adjust volume if you want. Click directly here because the other day I used this and it wasn't working.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's why this was moving. Because this is a remote. Hello, everyone. Buenos días. Can everyone hear us?
Hola, buenos días.
Hi, Samuel.
Yes.
Perfecto.
Hello.
So many people in the same room. Okay.
Can we show everybody and take a screenshot of everybody? Is there a way we can do
Stop
that?
the screen sharing and then.
What's that for?
You want to
Smile,
screen?
smile, please. You look very nice. Some of you are not using your cameras. You will forfeit the opportunity. Very good. Okay, here they come. Good. Okay, good. Very good. Cayo.
Wow,
All
look at
right.
that.
Good. Perfect. Okay, Claire. Everybody's on. Perfect. Very good. Cayo, muy bien. Kevin, perfecto. Perfecto. Mika, I don't know if you have a camera. We'd love to see you if you do. So can you take a screenshot of this?
3, 2, 1.
Smile. Okay, very good. Another one?
Smile.
Okay,
Oh.
great. Okay, thank you. So now we can get started formally.
Disable mine. Okay. So, oh, need to share screen again.
¿Qué equipo? ¡Qué buen equipo! Perfecto.
Great. Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to the webinar of the multi-level modeling course for Salurval data. We have a few announcements before we begin. Given the complexity of everything we have prepared for you in terms of logistics, we felt it would be good to just do this. So you should have received feedback on your research ideas yesterday. I believe Alejandro inundated all of you with emails. So thank you, Alejandro. So today we have the webinar, and while you are doing the webinar, please keep in mind your research idea and incorporate the feedback that we sent you yesterday and the knowledge from the webinar into that one-page summary that you will be doing. So that summary you should be sending by May 10th to Alejandro. You will have his email in the syllabus that we had already sent you. Today we will be sending you the template for that summary and an example, so you see what kind of detail we are looking for there. And remember, the idea of this summary is that we get you thinking about your research idea. We can discuss it when we are in Belo Horizonte, and we can potentially do even an analysis with that. So in order to be able to do that, I need to be able to prepare the data. So I need to be able to have enough detail there, because you will see the example. And a reminder, everyone needs to send this, even if you have an approved proposal. If you have an approved proposal, just summarize it in that template, and that's it. Then by May 16th, you will receive a link with the data sets and the R or data code for the labs of the workshop, where we'll be doing some practicing on how to code this kind of models, etc. Please download this before the workshop so that we are not there on the first day waiting for everyone to download everything. For those of you that will be using R for the first time, you will also receive a document explaining how to install it, how to install RStudio and the packages that you need. Please follow the entire document. Don't just install R, but follow all of the instructions so that you are ready to go when you get there. For those of you that have already used R, just make sure that you have all of the packages that are in that document. And for those of you using Stata, that's fine. That's you should be ready to go as long as you have it already installed. In the workshop, you will be asked to sign a data use and confidentiality agreement. We will send it in advance with this email. So if you want to read and print it before and bring it, that's great, and sign it. Otherwise, we'll have copies there for you to sign. This is important because this is Salurval data that you will need to handle carefully and delete after the workshop. So the data use agreement has all the details. In the workshop, we'll do 3 labs on linear, logistic, and Poisson regression, and we'll also have discussion of the modeling approaches with your ideas, plus some basic models that we're doing live to interpret coefficients. Remember, before the workshop and during the workshop, start preparing this presentation that you will have to do during the main Salurval meeting. In this presentation, essentially, the idea is that you will be split into 5 small groups by type of research. What? Okay, yeah. And within each group, you will have a moderator that will keep everything moving, and you will briefly present your idea and get feedback from everyone else in the group. This is during the main Salurval meeting. You will need to send this presentation to Claire by 9 p.m. on May 21st. So have it ready before the workshop. I mean, most of it you can already fill now, like data, like the background, the main question, you can already fill before the workshop. And during the workshop, you will make edits there. You will say, oh, I now realize I need to use a logistic regression, so I'll change that. So make sure you have it ready before the workshop, and then you fine tune it during the workshop. Okay. So
I wonder if it's helpful, maybe you already said this, but to send them a template for that presentation.
That will be sent. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. So what we today, after all of this is done, and we are done with this webinar, we'll send you an email with the recording of the webinar, the template of the one-page summary and an example, the template of this presentation, a reminder of all deadlines, and the instructions for R. I think that's everything we're sending you, and the data use agreement too. So you will be getting a link with all of these things and reminders of all of this. Okay. For today, if you have a question, please, if you can use the Zoom has this raise hand thingy. You can use that and we'll call your name and you can ask your question, or alternatively, what you can do is type your question in the chat, and when we see it, we'll read it and answer it for you. We want to do this to avoid, the chaos of everyone opening their mic at the same time. So please either raise your hand and then you will call your name so you can ask, or type the question and we'll read it whenever we say it. Okay. Okay. Let me close this one. And that one.
Okay, so are there any questions at this point? From what Usama, the general process? Okay. So how do I? Is there a question? This is the.
I have. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
A quick question regarding that session in the first day of Solverbal, where we present our work with the templates. I understand that all of the researchers won't be assigned to small group, but rather would ruminate freely between us.
Yes, this is
Okay.
Claire. Yes, so the idea is to assign 1 or 2 moderators to each of the groups, and the groups will be organized by, hopefully by theme. So we'll group people together based on their topic, and then we'll assign 1 or 2 moderators to each group, and then the rest of the participants in the meeting will be able to go to whatever group is of interest.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So that's an opportunity for you to share. We thought it was important for the workshop participants to have the opportunity to share with the larger project what they're up to and get input, and it's another way to sort of advance the work. Okay, there are no other questions. I'm just going to start off. So I'm going to, Usama and I divided this up into two parts. I'm going to give a bit of an overview and introduction to multi-level analysis. And then Usama will go into more, some specific topics. And, if you're hearing this for the first time, not every, you might not follow absolutely everything. That's okay. You can hear it again, and, over time, it'll start to come together, and at the workshop, it'll come together even more. And when you actually do the analysis, then you'll really know what you're doing. So it's a process. So just to start off, oops, the left one, okay, got it. So just to start off, it's very common in all of the data that we work with in epidemiology that there are levels of organization. And these levels of course exist within individuals, organ systems, tissue, cells, etc. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about levels in this context. Rather, we're talking about levels of organization above individuals. So various groups within which individuals are nested. Families, peer groups, workplaces, neighborhoods, cities, regions, and countries. And the presence of these multiple levels results often in the fact that we have nested data structures, because we have data for different levels and they're nested within each other. So this is really the norm rather than the exception in epidemiology and in public health. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you always have to consider every single possible level when you're doing an analysis, because that would be impossible, but rather that it's very important to think ahead of time conceptually about, based on what your research question is, what the important levels are to answering that question. And this is a topic that we will come back to again and again, because in my experience, clarity in formulating a multi-level question is the hardest, sometimes the hardest, but also the most important part of the whole process. So what are the implications of the fact that we have these multiple levels and nested data structures? The first implication is that we can define units of analysis at different levels. So if we have, and we'll talk about some Salud Bao specific examples in a minute, but if we have people nested within cities, you could analyze the data with cities as the unit of analysis or with people as the unit of analysis. There are also constructs that may be of interest defined at different levels. So there are things that characterize cities, like our measures of fragmentation or street connectivity. There are things that characterize individuals, like their weight or their education or their age. So for each level, you can define constructs that might be important to your research. There's also variability at different levels. So in the example of people nested within cities, if you're looking at, say, body mass index, the mean body mass index, and you have a body mass index for each person, there's a total variability in body mass index in your data, the standard deviation, for example, or the variance. But that can be split up into components. There's a piece of that variability that's occurring between cities, because maybe cities differ in their average BMI, and there's a piece of that variability that's occurring within cities, because even people within the same city have different BMIs. And this idea of decomposing variance across levels is very important in multi-level analysis. Multi-level analysis, in fact, allows us to do that in ways that other approaches do not. And we can study how different factors contribute to variability at different levels. And this often provides clues regarding the drivers of these outcomes, the causes of these outcomes. And of course, we can have effects on the outcome of predictive variables at different levels. So if we're looking at BMI, we might see an impact of a person's own education on their BMI. We also might see the impact of the fragmentation of the city on average BMI for that city, or on the BMI of everybody living in that city. And also, and this is also a very interesting element that multi-level analysis, as you'll see, allows us to do, we can also look at interactions between variables at different levels. So we might think that perhaps the impact of living on a more fragmented city on BMI differs depending on the person's education. So for lower income people, there's a stronger effect. For higher income people, for example, there's a weaker effect. And you might have some theories about why that might be. And so here we're looking at interactions, statistical interactions between a city level factor and an individual level factor. And you'll see that the multi-level approach allows us to look at that. I don't know if I'm just going to pause for a second now in case there are any questions. Don't know. You're checking the questions. Okay. So at any point, feel free to send in any questions that you have or anything that you need to clarify. So the fact that we have units at different levels means that we can also define different types of study design based on the unit of analysis. And we're not going to be able to go into this in a lot of detail today, but I believe this may be in the bibliography that we sent you, a more detailed description of the differences between different kinds of studies, but I'm just going to summarize them briefly here, and we'll talk more about them as we go through various analytical approaches. But if we think of the simple situation where we have individuals nested within cities as an example, we basically have three different options of study design. One is a purely ecologic study where the unit of analysis are groups, in this case cities. We're going to use groups in a generic way to refer to an aggregate. So the dependent and independent variable are measured at the city level. And the inferences that we draw about causation are at the group level. So we say if city X has this characteristic, it leads to this change in the outcome for city X. we have a lot of limitations in drawing conclusions about individual level relationships from this kind of data. That's what's referred to as the ecologic fallacy. So we can look at group level constructs, but we can't really look at individual level variables, only proxies for them. So we could look at the mean education of the city, but not the individual level education, because everything is analyzed at the level of the group. The individual level study, which is the one that you may be most familiar with because it's the study that's usually talked about in epidemiology, the units of analysis are individuals. We're looking at variance across individuals, so the inferences that we're drawing are about individual level relationships. We usually cannot say a lot about intergroup differences unless we have individuals sampled from multiple groups. And we can't really look at group level variables. There's one exception to that, which is contextual analysis that I'll talk about later. And of course, we can look at individual level variables. And the multi-level studies is, in a sense, integrates these two study designs in some ways. And so in some ways, it sort of gets the best of both worlds. So as you'll see later on, the units of analysis are simultaneously groups and individuals. We can draw inferences about differences across groups and also about differences among individuals. And we can look at both group and individual level constructs. So that's what's appealing about multi-level analysis, that it allows us to sort of bridge these two different kinds of studies. So these are just some examples of nested data structures that are amenable to multi-level analysis before we get into the details, just so you see how flexible this is. So it can be people within neighborhoods, states and countries, patients within providers, workers and workplaces, siblings and families, people in social networks, participants in research studies, so it's used for meta-analysis, for example, participants in repeat cross-sectional surveys, or even multiple measures on an individual over time. And in all of these cases, you can think about, basically all these are two-level examples, where you can think of a lower level and a higher level of aggregation, within which the lower level observations are nested. And these are just some pictures that show, some of those examples. Two-level structures where you have people nested within places, three-level structures, region, neighborhood, person, a cross-sectional, repeat cross-sectional design where you have, say, two surveys done at different time points. In this case, the year 92 and the year 93 in different places, and you have people sampled in different, in the surveys. A repeat measures design where you have multiple measures on an individual over time in the year 90, 91, 92, 93, for example, and people are also nested within places. Multivariate responses, so if you have multiple measures, say, of quality of life on a person and you want to treat them as separate outcomes, but they're measuring the same underlying construct, you can also use multi-level analysis for that. And even more complicated situations that we're not going to get into yet, but you should be aware that they're possible, which are cross-classified structures, where things are not necessarily hierarchically nested within each other, but where you have people across the middle in the figure who are nested within neighborhoods and also nested within workplaces, but they're not hierarchical within each other. Not people in the same neighborhood may work at different places, for example. And you may think that features of the neighborhood, features of the workplace, and individual level characteristics are all important to the research question that you're focused on. Now in Salurval, what levels do we have in Salurval? So this is a list of levels that we have. There may even be more, but for now, we have countries, we have L1ADs, we also have L1UXs, but we're not going to talk about that now. We're just going to focus on the L1ADs for simplicity, but something at the city level, sub-cities, which are our L2s, neighborhoods are L3s, and also when we have survey data, we have individual level respondents. You can see that there are already 4 different levels here that we could think about in terms of outcomes and explanatory variables. How are these nested within each other? Well, here's an example. So L1ADs are nested within countries, L2s are nested within L1ADs, L3s are nested within L2s, and people, respondents, I just showed a few, are nested within L3s. If we don't have the L3 level for the survey respondent, which in some cases we don't yet, then the people will be nested within the L2s. Just a little variant that this is a little more complicated, but I just want to put it out there for the future maybe. For mortality data, it's possible also to think about cross-classified cells as the lowest level of availability. And so I showed a picture here where you could, for each L3 or for each L2, if we want to skip the L3, you could create a mini little table like this where you have young and old people, men and women, for example, and for each cell, you have the number of people in the denominator and the number of deaths. And you can think of those 4 cells as repeat measures within the level. And it turns out you can do this allows you to do some interesting things. I don't know if we'll be able to get into this in much detail over this course, but for the future, some of you may pursue this. So I just wanted to mention it. So, important things to keep in mind as you think about levels in Salud Val and your own research proposals. Definitely, what is the question? This is critical and probably the most important piece. At what level is the outcome defined? Is the outcome that you're focused on individual level BMI, or is it the mortality rate for the city? Or is it the mean air pollution level for the L2? What other levels are important in answering your research question? So at what level is the outcome defined, but then what other levels are important at the exposure level? What are the relevant constructs and the levels at which they are defined, and how are they measured? And what are the specific hypotheses that derive from your question? Because those hypotheses, when you define your multi-level model, you need to be able to say exactly how you're going to use the model, i.e. exactly what coefficients from the model are going to provide a test of your hypothesis. Sometimes it's not a single coefficient, sometimes it's a combination of coefficient. But that's the whole purpose of the multi-level approach, to test specific hypotheses. And those hypotheses need to be articulated and reflected, operationalized in the way that you're specifying the model. So any questions on this general piece? Okay, so now we're going to go through different options for analyzing a nested data structure. And we're going to gradually, we're going to begin with some simpler options that you might be familiar with, and then we're going to finally get to what the multi-level model is. And we're going to use an example of just a 2-level structure of individuals nested within a group. And I put group in quotes because it can be many different things. Let's take the example of individuals nested within a city, within an L1AD, just as an example. So in Salud Val, this could be the ith individual in the jth group, could be, for example, the ith individual in the jth city, or it could also be the ith city log mortality rate in the jth country, for example. In this case, it would be cities nested within countries. I'm going to talk about the example, I'm going to use the red as the example. So I'm going to talk about BMI for individuals nested within a city. But it's of course generalizable to other kinds of levels. Oh, I have another example. Sub-city air pollution in the jth city. This is for Nelson, an example for Nelson. So the first option is to ignore the cluster, the level 2. Oh, one important thing here. So we have used the level terminology in Salurbal, so that level 1 is the largest aggregation, level 2 is the subcity, level 3 is the smaller unit within the neighborhood. In multi-level analysis, sometimes that terminology is flipped, so that can be a little bit confusing. The lower level, level 1, is the most disaggregated measure, and the numbers go up as the aggregation increases. So that might be a little bit tricky, but we can go through it. So the first option, if we have repeat measures of BMI, example from the Salurbal surveys that we've harmonized in different cities, is to say, okay, forget the city. I'm just going to put all the data together, and I'm going to do an individual level regression where I model the BMI for person I in city J as a function, say, of their income. So Xij is the income. This is an individual level regression. It's similar to what you've already, I'm sure, done. The unit of analysis is the individual. We examine only between individual variability. The intercept and the slope, the B0 and the B1, are the same for all the cities. We're not making any allowance for city differences. And we're not including in this regression, of course, anything about the city. So if there was something about the city that might affect the person's BMI, like how walkable the city was, we wouldn't be considering it here. And there is a potential problem in this analysis, which is that if people who live in the same city share certain characteristics by virtue of living in the same city that affect their BMI, that means that their BMIs are going to be correlated. So if I know a person's BMI from city A, that tells me something about the BMI for another person who lives in city A. And that's not being properly accounted for. It's not being captured in the model. So this is a problem of residual correlation in the data as a result of the fact that you have people in different cities. And so that can affect your standard errors primarily, sometimes also your point estimates. So that's a statistical problem that we have because we're not accounting for city in the purely individual level analysis. So I think I'm going to skip this. A second option is to do an ecologic regression. So here, what we would do is just take the mean for all the individuals in the city, calculate the mean BMI for the city, and then do a regression where we model the mean BMI for the city on the mean income for the city. So this is a purely ecologic regression at the city level. The unit of analysis here is the city, in this case, the group, but in our example, specifically, it's the city. We're examining variability across cities, but not across individuals or between or within cities. It's just across cities. There's no information on the cross-classification of individual level variables within the groups. What does this mean? That I'm not using information on, within each city, I have people, and for each person, I have their BMI and their income, say, or their education, if that's a variable. But I'm not taking into consideration whether those who have high BMI have high income or the opposite. I'm just creating an average for each one. I'm just taking the marginals. And that has this is really the origin of the classic ecologic fallacy. It's the reason why I can't draw individual level inferences from these data. Now, in principle, there's no residual correlation problem because the individuals, I'm not looking at the individuals separately. I'm aggregating them up. I'm creating means. However, there is a situation where there might still be residual correlation. I don't know if you can think of it, but one possibility might be if the cities are clustered within countries, for example, and there's something about the country that's important, that's affecting BMI, like all the cities in a certain country tend to have higher BMIs because there's something about the country that's important. I am not taking into consideration the fact that there's correlation between the city level means for different countries. And so this is an example where I'm omitting a higher level, which is the country, and that's inducing the residual correlation. Any questions so far? So another option would be to have separate individual level regressions for each city. So here you can see that it's similar to the first option I showed you, but now the coefficients have a J subscript, because that means that I'm fitting this regression separately for each city. So here the unit of analysis is still the individual, because that's where the outcome and the exposure are at the individual level. But I'm allowing the intercepts and the slopes to differ from city to city because of those J subscripts and because the regression is separate for each city. So that means the mean level, which is sort of the intercept, it's capturing differences in the mean, is different for each city. And the association of income with BMI is also different potentially in each city. Now, the problem is, you know, that's nice in some ways, because if the city is important, we can see how the intercepts and the slopes vary across cities, but we can't really tell, well, what is the city level factor that is associated with those differences? Is it cities that are more fragmented, have a higher BMI in general, or have stronger inequalities in BMI? We don't know, we can't tell from this. And also, of course, so we cannot investigate group level variables. And of course, if we have a lot of cities but few observations per city, our estimates for a given city are going to be unstable, right? And so we're going to have, you know, we're going to have a lot of different coefficients, and some of them are going to be estimated with a lot of error. And so it's difficult to draw conclusions from this. Now, in principle, we would have a residual correlation problem here because we're treating each city separately. A fourth option would be to say, okay, I'm going to pool all the individual level data from all the cities. I don't want to do a separate regression for each city, but I don't want to do the ecologic analysis because I know that I'm losing information by doing that. So I could pool all the individual level data and include a dummy variable for each group. And this is what this equation shows. So it's an individual level. So Yij is the BMI for person I in city J. And we have, let's suppose we have 4 cities here. So we have 3 dummy variables to capture the city effect. And then we have the impact of income, Xij, but we allow the impact of income to vary by city. So we do that with those interaction terms by interacting the dummies with the Xij. So here, the benefit, well, here the unit of analysis is still the individual. This is still individual level analysis. We take into account the group by incorporating it as a dummy variable. And this allows the intercepts and slopes to differ from group to group in a single model. So this is nice. It's an improvement over option 3. It still doesn't allow us to know what group characteristics are important because we're just including the city as a dummy. So we don't know what it is. Is there some pattern? You know, cities with certain characteristics have stronger slopes. We can't tell from this. All we can tell is whether things differ across cities. This can be inefficient if there are many groups, and the inferences are limited to groups in the sample. So it really, in some ways, it ignores the fact that these cities could be thought of as samples from a broader population of cities. And this is why you'll see this approach referred to as fixed effects, because the effects of the cities are fixed and the inferences refer to the cities in your sample specifically, cannot be generalized to a broader population of cities. This is a bit of a technical point, but so that's this idea that they're treated as fixed. So this is an improvement, but in terms of really making use of all of the data and understanding both between group, being able to quantify both variability between groups, but it has some limitations in terms of what we can conclude. So if there's no residual correlation problem, unless there's any other omitted level, but if these are the only 2 important levels, there's no residual correlation problem because we're capturing the group impact in the regression equation. Another example, another variant, option 5, is to say, okay, yeah, I like having the dummies, but I want to be able to look at the group level effect, the effect of a particular group level variable, like the city fragmentation. So the unit of analysis, so here, all I've done is added the group level variable, the city level variable, so the fragmentation of the city. So here, the unit of analysis is still the individual. We can look at the group level variable. That beta 2 tells me the effect of city fragmentation of BMI after adjusting, say, for the individual level income. And I could also interact the CJ with the XIJ to see whether fragmentation modifies the slope. So we can do that, but we cannot quantify the between group variation per se here. And it's possible that there's still residual correlation if that group level variable, the city level variable that we've included, is not fully capturing all the dimensions of the city that affect the outcome. So this is what's been called contextual analysis, and what was used in the sociological literature, for example, 1960s and 70s quite a bit. So finally, we get to the multi-level model, which you'll see is really just building on the various options that we've seen so far. So in the multi-level model, and there are many different terms for multi-level models. I think the term multi-level is being used now more consistently, but you may also see historical literature that calls them hierarchical models. Sometimes the term hierarchical models is used for different things, though. Random effects or random coefficient models is another term that's used for multi-level models as well.
Mixed effects.
Mixed effects models, variance component models. I think I have some synonyms at the end. So what we would do here is we would, in the multi-level model, we basically initially define an equation at the lower level, in this case, an equation for each city. So it's an individual level model for each city. So this is actually one of the options that we saw, right? Where we have the intercept and the slope differ from city to city, and there's a variance of the error, which is, this is the normal error variance. But we define equations at a higher level of aggregation, at a second level, where we model the intercept as a function of a fixed component, a common component across all cities, and a piece that varies from city to city. And that piece is that variation is assumed to have a certain distribution. It's assumed to be normally distributed with a mean of 0 and a variance called tau 0, 0. And we do the same thing for the slope. The slope has a common piece across all the cities, and then a piece of the slope that we allow to vary across cities. And we assume a certain distribution of those macro level errors. That's what we call those. So we have an individual or micro level error in the equation at 1, the first level equation, and which is the EIJ, and then we have macro level errors, tau 0, 0 and tau 1, 1, and even a covariance between the intercept and the slope at the city level. So the covariance of the intercept and the slope would, for example, allow for the possibility that cities that have a higher intercept also have a steeper slope, for example. Now, so here we are we're capturing variability within cities through the first level equation, and then we're capturing variation across cities in the intercepts and in the slopes through the second level equations. But we don't have any group level variables in this model yet, but that's easy to do. We can add them to the second level equations as I show here. So all we're doing is we're saying, okay, there's variation in the intercept across cities, but it's not just random, it's a function of certain variables. It's influenced by certain it's correlated with certain variables. So for example, fragmentation. So we put in fragmentation Cj, and that allows fragmentation to affect the intercept, and we also allow fragmentation to affect the slope. So that means that the intercept and the slope are going to vary in part as a function of fragmentation, but they still have an error component which remains unexplained, the U0J and the U1J. So there's still tau 00 and tau 11. We may see when we include the Cj that the variance, the tau 00, is now smaller than it used to be because we're explaining a piece of it. And similarly, if there was variance in the slope and the Cj, the fragmentation explains the variance in the slope, we will see the tau 1 become smaller. And so we can play around with that and see what happens when we add different variables to the model. So some characteristics of multi-level analysis that are important is that it's recognizing sort of the uniqueness of each group through this U0J and U1J. It's allowing each city to be a little bit different. It's modeling group to group variability as a function of a fixed component and a random component. So the fixed component, the Cj, affects all cities. So it's called a fixed component, and the U0J is the random component. Now these equations are estimated through an iterative process. So it's not like first we fit the first one and then we output the coefficients and fit the next one. It's done through an iterative algorithm, which is why it's more efficient. So that's why you need special software to do this. You can't just run multiple regressions, output the regression coefficients, and then run a second level equation. It allows addition of group level variables, and it's capturing the residual correlation through these residual macro level errors are allowing each city to have its own unique piece. And so we don't have the residual correlation problem because that's how we're accounting for it, through the macro level errors. So here, if we were able, actually, let me see, we are able to draw a picture of what these coefficients look like. So if you look at the figure 3 is sort of a picture of a graphical representation of what the model is doing. So the x-axis, say, is our income, and the y is the BMI. And so we have a relationship between income and BMI, which is estimated by a fixed component, but there's variability around that slope. And there's also variability around the intercept. So both the intercept and the slope have variability. So I think we're going to skip this in the interest of time. I think I've talked a little bit about this. So how do we interpret the coefficients? Well, they're pretty straightforward. We have a common intercept across the groups, a common slope associated with the xij across the groups, the effect of the city level factor on the intercept, and the effect of the city level factor on the slope. And then we have random coefficients, the unique deviation of the intercept of each city from the overall intercept after accounting for the effect of Cj, the unique deviation of the slope within each group from the overall slope after accounting for the effect of Cj, the variances of the group-specific intercepts and slopes, and the covariance of the group-specific intercepts and slopes. Now, we can put this together into a single equation. And so all I've done here is I've taken the level, basically we take the level 1 equation. Let me see if I can
use the keyboard to go back.
Yeah, can you just go back? Oh, I can do this. Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's easier, much better. So, oops. So if you take the second level equation, the B0J, and you replace in the first level equation, and then you do the same thing for the B1J, just replace this equation in the first level equation, we get a common single equation, which is there at the top. So you have the equation for the intercept plus the equation for the slope multiplied by the slope variable, in this case income. And then all I've done is to sort of reorder the coefficients just so you can see how you can interpret them from the full equation. The effect, a common intercept, the effect of city fragmentation on BMI, the effect of individual level income on BMI, after, of course, each of these after adjusting for everything else, the interaction between fragmentation and income, and then the random components, the residual error in the intercept, the residual error in the slope, and the individual level error. So because U0J and U1J are common for observations in the same group and their variability depends on Xij, it's a complex error term, which is why you need special estimation methods to fit these models. Now you'll see, I think in both Stata and R, you don't specify the model in levels, right? Usama, you specify the model, or do you do it in levels? You could do it both ways.
Yeah.
Okay. So depending on the software, you might write out the model in levels, or you might specify the model in its summary form as a single equation, like I'm doing here. I think it's helpful as especially as you're learning these models, to think in levels, even though later you're going to put it all together because it's just easier. But it's useful for you to think of levels. So I think I already talked about this. Of course, all these interpretation of all these coefficients are what technically we say conditional on the random effects. And that's an important nuance that maybe we can get to at some point. But it's basically, it's sort of assuming or adjusting for these random effects. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but so another example, something that Usama's going to get into more, is that in addition to getting estimates of the coefficients, we get estimates of the variance components. And this is very important. So we get an estimate of the variability in BMI within cities, which is going to be that sigma squared. And we also get variance of the variability between groups, between cities in the intercepts and in the slopes. And we can examine how both types of variability change as variables are added to the model. So we already talked about what would happen if we add a group level variable like city fragmentation or something else about the city. We might see the variance between cities go down, right? Because it's explaining it. Now, could we see the variance within cities go down if we add a city level variable? I'm going to ask the only person I can ask here, who is Ariela. What do you think? If you add a city level variable, could you see the variance in BMI within a city go down?
If you add a city level variable, yep.
You couldn't, right? Because it's not explaining any variability within the city, because it's a city. It's the same for everybody, just between cities, exactly. So group level variables will only explain between group variability by definition, right? What about individual level variables? So when you add an individual level, let's suppose we had income in here, and let's suppose we add age. So if we add age to the level 1 equation, could we see the within city variance become smaller? Potentially, yes. Santiago, I can see, is nodding his head. Okay, so yes, because if people differ in age, then when we add age, we might see the within city variance become reduced. What about the between city variance? Is there any circumstance under which the between city variance could become smaller when I add an individual level variable to the model? This is an important question, because if we understand the answer to this question, then we understand a lot about what's going on here. Any guesses? So what would happen if the cities, I have some cities that are older and some cities that are younger. If I didn't have age in the model, some of the variability that I'm seeing between cities may just be because some cities are older than others. And let's suppose BMI goes up with age. So when I add age to the model, then I would see the between city difference become reduced, the between city difference in the intercept, for example.
Jessica says, if city composition is different, yes.
Exactly, perfect. That's exactly the right answer. So the question is that this is why we can separate out the effect of context and composition, because we can adjust, by adjusting for the individual level variables, we can see whether there's an effect of context that is not due to compositional differences in the cities. Now, of course, if you have an individual level variable that's a mediator of your city effect, then just like in any regression, there are questions about whether it's a confounder or a mediator. This is no different than the general issues that in any regression, right? But if it is a confounder, then you can estimate the group level effect independent of the individual level compositional characteristics. Do we have any other questions or comments? So, I showed you a general model, but of course it can be modified. If you add variables to the model, and finally the variances of the U0Js and U1Js are 0, then that means you don't need them anymore. So, because you've basically explained all the variation between groups, there's no residual correlation, and this variance defaults, this model defaults to a contextual model, really. Of course, there are statistical tests you can use, and Usama may talk a little bit about this, to determine whether the variances are, 0 or not. And also, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what group level variables you include and for what coefficients. So I showed you a generic example where we have, one group level variable in the second level equations. You could have more than one, of course. You could have some variables in one for one coefficient, not for another. You could do statistical tests to determine what you really need, because of course, imagine if you have lots of group level variables and lots of coefficients, this gets very complicated very quickly, and sometimes you don't have enough data to be able to really sustain that level of complexity in the model. So this is a little bit of jargon. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to point out that sometimes multi-level models are called because they're conditional on the random effects for each unit, they're called the unit-specific approach, to differentiate it from the population average approach, which is the marginal model, GEE, that some of you may know. Sometimes the term here, this is like my term, but it's called subject specific. You'll see it called subject because all of these models were sometimes initially used to do to look at repeat measures on individuals over time. So it's subject specific, but because it's more general, I prefer to use a unit. So this is a bit of a philosophical discussion. It has some implications which we can get to later, but. So it retains the multi-level structure of the data, doesn't collapse everything like the individual level or the ecologic model does. We can look at individual level, group level variables, how they're related to individual level outcomes. We can look at how group level variables are related to group specific intercepts and slopes. And we can look at between and within group variability and how they're explained by different variables. So these are the kinds of questions that you can look at. It is stated in a generic way. Are group level variables related to individual level outcomes after controlling for individual level variables? Are the effects of individual level variables modified by group factors? What proportion of the total variance in individual level outcomes is within and between groups? How do within and between group variance change as variables are added? is there residual variation between groups after accounting for available individual level and group level variables? So here, in all these examples, I'm talking about, I'm using the terms generically individuals and groups, and so you can think of individuals and cities, but of course, all of this is applicable to a situation where you have cities nested within countries, for example, or L2s nested within L1 ADs. So even though I'm using the term individual there, it's not always individuals at the lowest level, right? It can be anything, really. So let's talk about some examples in Salurval, the kinds of questions, making it more specific to us. So how much does city mortality vary between and within countries, or city life expectancy? Usama has looked at this in one of his papers. How are city and country level factors related to mortality after adjusting for each other? We have a limited number of countries, so that's a bit more challenging, but in principle, we could do that. Is there interaction between city and country level factors? What factors explain variability between and within countries in mortality? So in this case, it's all examples that use two levels, cities nested within countries. Another example using Salurval survey data. How much does BMI vary between and within cities? How are city and individual level factors related to BMI after adjusting for each other? Is there interaction between city and individual level factors? What factors explain variability between and within cities? So this is two levels, survey respondents nested within cities. Ariela is working on a paper on diabetes that uses this approach. So there could be a three level with country. We don't have a lot of countries, so sometimes we prefer to include countries as a dummy, which is called a country fixed effect. We'll talk more about that later. We don't need to worry a lot about that right now. In some analyses that Nelson has been doing, his outcome is air pollution levels for level 2s. And so here we would have level 2s nested within level 1 ADs. And so we can look at how much does air pollution vary within cities, across level 2s within cities? How much does it vary between cities? What level 2 and level 1 AD factors account for that variability, and how are they related to air pollution levels? It's always kind of the same kinds of questions. So getting back to what I was saying at the beginning, a really important aspect is to, as you can see, these models can get very complicated very quickly, so it's really important to clearly formulate the substantive research question. Sometimes writing the model can help you refine the question because it helps you see the other possibilities that you hadn't thought of. So it's a little bit of an iterative process, but it's important for you to have a clear research question. So in the workshop, we'll spend a lot of time also making sure that we're clear on what the questions are that we're asking. Then identifying the levels of organization that are relevant, and here are the possibilities that we have in Salurval. Defining the units and variables at each level, formulating the statistical model, and defining exactly how you will use the statistical model to answer the substantive research question, specifically what coefficient you will look at. And I think that's it. These are some synonyms and related terms to multi-level models. Actually, I'm missing mixed effects models. I don't know why, but just so that you know that you may come across these models with different terminologies. So this is the end of part 1. Now we can have some music. So any questions or comments? No questions. Okay. Okay. So I think I'm going to turn it over then to Usama. Oops.
Okay, thank you. So in this second part, we'll talk about some. Oops, no, that's the same one. Some specific aspects of this of the models we just talked about, the regular linear multi-level models. Aspects, and we don't really need to go over all of these ones. I just kept all of them here just so that we can get to them if we have time. I really want to talk about variance explain and hypothesis testing at least. And then we'll talk about generalized linear mixed models that are just the extension to logistic and Poisson. I see a question by Marianela that is asking, so are fixed effects models a type of multi-level model as well? Not in the
Not
sense,
really.
not of the type of model that we are talking about here.
Right. So I think that the one thing to keep in mind is that the term fixed effects is sometimes used a little bit differently by different disciplines. So in the multi-level modeling literature, you'll see sometimes the coefficients that do not vary across higher level units are sometimes called fixed coefficients. The economics literature often uses the term fixed effects to describe models that are not multi-level models, but are simply models that have a dummy for each higher level unit. So that one of the options that I showed you that had the group as a dummy, that would be a fixed effect model. So technically, it's not a multi-level model on its own. We can include in Salud Val, we can include countries as fixed effects, which means just as a dummy for each country and still have a multi-level model. But that's sort of a multi-level model with a fixed effect for country. I hope that answered it, Marianela.
And the key idea is that that group level variable, that group level identifier, it's fixed. It's just that coefficient for that country or that city.
Correct.
Instead of being a coefficient that comes from a distribution of cities. That would be the random one. So when we talk about multi-level models, we talk about the ones in which the group variable, the group effect, it comes from a distribution. That's the idea there. That's the key difference with fixed effects models, which also have its use. That's different. Okay, so the first part is that I wanted to talk about is on the concept of how do we explain variance, and we kind of talk a little bit about it now. But one of the best things about multi-level models, as compared to fixed effects models, for example, is that you can partition the variance into what happens at one level and what happens on another level. What happens at the individual level, how do individuals within groups vary, and what happens at the group level, how do groups vary compared to other groups. And this can serve two key purposes. The first one is this understanding of how much variability there is at each level compared to the other levels. For example, are my observations very clustered in neighborhoods? Or are people not segregated at all and they live and they are distributed randomly across neighborhoods? That could be something useful because that can tell us something about the phenomena that distribute people. And also, as you add variables to the model at different levels, you can check how this variance at different levels changes. And this allows you to understand things about the effect of this variable. We kind of mentioned this a little bit. If you add a level 1 variable and the second level variability decreases, that tells you that there is a difference in city composition, as Jessica said before. Okay, so those are two key things: understanding how much variability there is at each level compared to each other, and how much this variability changes after adding variables. Those are two aspects. So starting with the simplest multi-level model possible. So it's even simpler than the ones we have seen before. This is a model in which we have a first level equation, let's say individual people. So these are individuals in which we have an outcome, let's say a BMI, and we have no covariate there at all. But what we do have is this group level intercept, the group specific in intercept. So then we go to the second level, neighborhoods, and we define that group level intercept with two components. The first one is the overall mean. So this is the mean of BMI in all of our sample. And then we have this deviation from that overall mean, right? So it's the same model you saw before, but simplified without any covariate at all. So what this allows us is to see how much variability there is at the first level, individual people, and how much variability there is at the second level, neighborhoods. So if we look at this in a graphical way, in mind we have this. Each of these black dots is a person with its level of BMI, and the dashed red line is the average BMI in the neighborhood where those individuals live. Okay, So that red line is that neighborhood level mean, and then each dot is each individual. And you see these deviations here that you see here, those deviations are the level 1 residual. So the deviation from the neighborhood level mean to the each person's BMI. Now imagine we have 4 neighborhoods, and in each one of them, everything is kind of similar. Now, if we take the city level mean, which should be somewhere around there, then what we can do is calculate how much does each neighborhood mean deviate from the city level mean, right? So each of these black arrows here tells you how much variability there is at the neighborhood level. Okay, so if we go and we look at the equation that we just looked at, the simplified first level equation, each of these Yij is the level of BMI in each person. So this person I, living in neighborhood J, has this BMI here. Now the BOJ, which is the group level mean, or the neighborhood level mean in this case, or the city level mean, if these were people nested in cities, that's the neighborhood mean here, the one that the red line. Then this level 1 residual is that red line that tells you the distance, the deviation of each individual from each neighborhood, from their neighborhood. And that variability, the average of that variability will be that level 1 variance, what we call sigma squared. So the overall variability within neighborhoods or between individuals is this red bracket here. Now, as we said, in the second level equation, what we are doing is essentially telling, okay, each of these neighborhood level means, each of these BOJ, so this will be BOJ for the first neighborhood, this will be BOJ for the second neighborhood, this will be BOJ for the third neighborhood, etc., is composed of 2 things. One of them is the city level mean, which is this line here, the black dash line here, and then a deviation from that dash line. And that deviation from the dash line, all of these black arrows here, have a variability. Okay, so that can tell you how much does the neighborhood level mean vary compared to the city level mean. And that variability is what we call tau 00. Okay, now the ICC, which is the first measure of variability that we are going to look at, and one of the key measures is essentially how much variability there is between neighborhoods compared to the total variability. So how much variability there is between neighborhoods compared to variability between neighborhoods plus variability within neighborhoods. So what this allows us to see is how much of the total variance is due to between neighborhood variation. See that Vanderlei is asking if the effect of a spatial dependence is considered by this composition of the model at different levels. What these models are doing are, right now, as we are seeing them, are assuming that everyone within the neighborhood is correlated with each other, because there is this common factor that affects them, right? That correlation between people living in the same neighborhood, that's the ICC. So this model takes into consideration this spatial dependence, but it doesn't assign it any spatial form. So if you live close to someone else, will tell you that your correlation is, let's say, 0.6, whatever the ICC is. If someone else is in the same neighborhood as you are, that's your correlation with them. We don't take into consideration your distance with them. We only take into consideration your membership to the neighborhood.
So that's exactly right. To add just one additional element to that, so you know, the spatial correlation is captured to the extent that it is well reflected by the neighborhoods. So if the spatial correlation is well captured by allowing people within each neighborhood to be correlated with each other, then it captures it. However, if there are spatial patterns across the neighborhoods, like neighborhoods that are close to each other are more similar than neighborhoods that are distant from each other, as Usama was saying, That's not captured in this model. It could be by including another level with groups of neighborhoods. If neighborhoods in a certain part of the city tend to be correlated, you could do that. And then there are also ways now to incorporate spatial correlation in the random effects. So the U0Js can be modeled to be spatially correlated through a spatial error modification, but that's more complicated. But that could be done if it's necessary.
Yes. So, but in this case, we're considering the simplest case in which everyone in the neighborhood is correlated with each other by the fact that they live in the same neighborhood. We don't care how far or closer away or whether there are spatial patterns within them. Okay, so this ICC as one of the key measures of how variability is split between levels. As a reminder, is how much of the total variance or the total variability is due to between neighborhood variation, and is calculated as tau 00 over the total variability. And the total variability is the sum of the individual level variability and the contextual level variability here. Okay. Now, one of the things that could happen here is, what if this is the same picture I just showed? You know, you have the city level mean, you have individual clusters in neighborhoods. What happens if this occurs? If all of the neighborhoods are closer to the city level mean, if the variability of the city level mean to the neighborhood level mean is smaller. So what happens is that you get a lower ICC. Now there is another way by which you could get a lower ICC, which is if you start with the same picture we showed before, but we now have that within the same neighborhood, all individuals vary a lot more. So if you follow the same equation we showed before, and this part below the red bracket is bigger, then what you have is a lower ICC. So you could have a lower ICC for two reasons. One of them is that neighborhoods are very similar to other neighborhoods, so they don't differ too much between them. Or you could have the neighborhoods are different, but individuals living within the neighborhoods are very different from each other. Those are two of the ways in which you could have lower ICC or lower clustering, or however you want to call it. Okay. Now, as I said before, one of the aspects of exploring variability in multi-level models is understanding how much variability there is at one level and how much variability there is at another level. Another aspect is what happens when you add variables to the model. When you add variables to the model at individual or at group level variables, the ICC and the variance components will change. Now, interpreting this is very useful to understanding what is the how are your health outcomes distributed within and between your groups. So, as we said before, adding level 2 variables can help explain the level 2 variance. Okay, so this tau 00, if you add a level 2 variable, it can go down. If that goes down, then the ICC will go down because you are already explaining some of that variability that happens at the second level. Now, as we said before, adding a level 2 variable cannot change the level 1 variance. Adding a level 1 variable, on the other hand, can help explain the level 1 variance. Now, it can also help explain the level 2 variance, and this is what we mentioned before. If level 1 variables are differentially distributed by neighborhood, because of segregation, because of other phenomenon, then adding level 1 variables can help reduce the ICC. So it's very useful when you do your multi-level model to start with that empty model in which you only have that random intercept. No, not that one, but that modeling, this model here. It's very useful to start with this. Examine the ICC there, so that you can see how much variability is within your groups and how much variability there is between your groups. And then, as you start adding components to this model, keep exploring how your level 1 variance changes, how your level 2 variance changes, and how the ICC changes. Because this can already tell you a whole lot about the phenomenon that you are studying there. Any questions so far?
So higher ICC, a higher value of the ICC means a higher proportion of the variance is between the neighborhoods in this case, and means a higher correlation between two people in the same neighborhood, right?
Higher ICC means people in the same neighborhood are more similar to each other than compared to other neighborhoods.
Right. A lower ICC means the opposite, less between neighborhood variability overall compared to total variability, lower within neighborhood correlation.
Exactly. And that could happen for two reasons, that neighborhoods are more similar to each other, or that people within the neighborhood are very different from each other. That's why sometimes we refer to it as clustering. We refer to it in many different names. But at the end, it's the ICC, intra-class correlation coefficient. Okay. Okay. So now, second aspect that we wanted to go over is hypothesis testing, because this is one of the key things that you will be doing here. On one side, you will be examining variability. On the other, you want to know something about the effect of covariance in your model. Now, the first one, testing fixed effects, and this is again where the terminology gets tricky again. By fixed effects here, we mean the covariance you add to the model, such as neighborhood SES, individual level income, individual level age, city level fragmentation, etc. So from now on, we talk about fixed effects, we're talking about covariance that we add to the model. When we talk about random effects, we are mentioning that the the random intercept, which is this variability between the city level mean and the neighborhood level mean, and that kind of thing. So fixed effects are covariance, and random effects are the deviations from either overall mean to the group level mean, or from the group level mean to the individual level value. So examples of questions that lead to hypothesis testing of fixed effects are things like, is neighborhood SES associated with BMI at the individual level? Does a model including neighborhood SES fit the data better than a model not including it? This is the same question, but we can test it in two different ways. The second aspect that we can be checking is whether random effects are meaningful or not. For example, a question about this is whether there is heterogeneity across neighborhoods in mean BMI. Okay, this is exactly what we were testing a moment ago. Another question that we can ask, which is quite different, is whether there is heterogeneity across neighborhoods in this association between neighborhood SES and BMI. Actually, that should be between individual level SES and BMI. Whether the effect of SES on BMI differs between neighborhoods. Could be that in some neighborhood there is an association, and in other neighborhoods there is no association. So how do we test fixed effects? So fixed effects, the first test that we can do is the usual one that you do in most regressions, which is you compare the coefficient estimate with its standard error. That's usually called the Wald test, and it's essentially doing one over the other. And alternatively, if you want to compare several coefficients at the same time, imagine you add a fixed effect for a country. Imagine you want to see if some countries have higher BMI than other countries, and you add, in our case, you add 10 dummies for country. One thing you can do is compare all of those parameters at the same time. By comparing them at the same time, you can answer the hypothesis of whether there are differences in country level BMI. Last, we can also, instead of testing coefficients, like running the model and looking at the coefficients, one thing you can do is compare nested models. So nested models are essentially a model in which you have the coefficient versus a model in which you remove the coefficient. You compare those two models, and if the model that has the coefficient has a better fit to the data, you can do that with the likelihood ratio test. Then what you can say is that adding that coefficient, adding that variable, actually added something to the model. Now, yes. Now, the other thing that you can be testing other than fixed effects are random effects. And there are two ways you can do this. The first one, which is, it's very easy to do, which is compare the variance compare the estimate of the tau 00 or any of these variance components with its standard error. Now, you need to be careful because this is something that is an approximate test. The variance cannot be below 0, so it's tricky. Statistically speaking, this is tricky. But it can give you some idea. If that variance component is very close to 0, then well, there isn't that much variability there. But the way in which you can do this is by doing a model with the random effect and doing a model without the random effect and comparing them. By doing this, you can understand whether the random effect is adding something, whether there is heterogeneity in either the neighborhood level mean or the effect of individual level SCS on BMI, whether that's different by neighborhoods. And actually, if you think about it, if you do a linear model, a regular linear model, and then you add a random intercept to it, which is this thing that allows you to see the variability between the city level mean and the neighborhood level mean, and you compare those two models, it tells you already a lot about whether there is clustering in BMI between neighborhoods, or whether BMI is distributed randomly across the city. Okay, so same thing as before. You fit one model, then you fit another one with a random effect, and then you compare them with the likelihood ratio test. We'll be doing some of these things in the labs when we do the in-person workshop. Okay, any question here? With variance, the variance components or hypothesis testing?
One quick thing I might add is that when you have a random slope, a random coefficient, the ICC is not as easy to calculate. So the example that Usama showed you is just with a random intercept. If you have a random slope, it gets more complicated. We're not going to get into it, but it doesn't matter for now, but it's not as straightforward. Okay.
Okay, so okay. The other thing I wanted to get into is in model building, because this will probably be one of the key things that we'll do during the workshop after you do the labs and we'll start discussing your own research ideas. One of the things we'll be doing is model building. Now there are many different ways and there are many different philosophical differences in how to do model driven, but I just wanted to show two of them. One of them is theory driven. It's essentially you have a very clear idea of your exposure and your outcome and what are the confounders. You have drawn a DAG, you have your framework very clear, and you know which things are confounders, which things are mediators, what is your main exposure, what is your main outcome. Everything is very clear. In such case, then you have a clear idea of the fixed effects that you want to include in this model. You want to include your exposure, which is the main fixed effect for which you will do the hypothesis testing, and then you include any confounders that are confounders of the exposure outcome association. Being careful to not include any mediators there. One thing you can do here is include random effects if you have a random effects or random slopes. If you hypothesize that there is a variability in the effect of that exposure by groups. So for example, if you're looking at the effect of income, individual level income on BMI, and you have people clustered in neighborhoods, you may have a hypothesis that the effect of income on BMI is different by neighborhood. So you can add a random effect there and test whether you need to keep it or not. Another way you can go around model building, instead of having a very clear idea of a very clear theory-driven idea of what are the confounders, etc., is do it in a more exploratory way, in which you can begin with this null model with the random intercept, check the ICC, see if there is a lot of clustering, then add individual level fixed effects, check the ICC, check for improvement in fit, see if this individual level fixed effects add anything to the prediction of the variable. And already checking the ICC can tell you a lot about whether you are reducing this individual level variability or the contextual level variability. You can also then, after that, add contextual level fixed effects. And again, check the ICC, check how this is changing, and check the improvement in fit. And finally, you can add random slopes, check for improvement in fit, and ever cross-level interactions. We haven't talked too much about this, but cross-level interactions are essentially if, for example, you hypothesize that the effect of individual income on BMI is different by levels of neighborhood level income, so that people living in poor neighborhoods have a different effect of income on BMI than people living in wealthier neighborhoods, you can add that interaction between variables at different levels. Okay, two key ways of going around model building, and we'll probably, when we get to the workshop, there will be people that have a very clear idea of their exposure, their outcome, and the confounders, and people that just want to see how this variable is distributed and what predicts it, without a very clear idea of what needs to go in each side. Okay, I'm gonna skip over model assumptions, and we'll do a little bit of this in the labs, but since this is something very important that you need to do while you are doing the model building, but still it's too much for this one. So I'll skip that. They are in the slides in case you want to look at that, and they are in the papers that we've distributed. One thing, very brief thing I want to mention, which we have touched a little bit on it, is that these models can be extended to be longitudinal. So if in original you had a level 1, you had people, and a level 2, you had neighborhoods, you can add a new level below people that is time, and have essentially repeated measures of BMI in each person. So if you have a cohort and you have measured someone in repeated times, those observations in the same individual will be correlated with each other. So you will need to acknowledge that. Or if you have a city nested within countries, and you had life expectancy in the city at different years, you can use this type of model to examine that variability over time. Are cities more similar to themselves over time than they are to other cities? That could be the kind of question that you could be asking here. Now I'll pause for a second to see if anyone has any question about any of these topics, and we'll go into the extension to logistic and Poisson models. Does anyone have any question about anything so far? And as Anna said before, this will become even more clear when you do the labs, and this will be even more clear when we do a little bit of model building, and when you present it to people, and when you present it to people again, and when you write the paper. Okay, so the second part, I wanted to just see very simply how do you extend these models into logistic and Poisson models. There are many tricky things here, so I'll just give a brief summary, and we can talk about it more in Belo Horizonte, or as you are working on your proposal. In part 1, what we were looking at, again, thing with the synonyms here, you were looking at linear mixed models, multi-level models, same thing, hierarchical linear models, etc. It's all the same, or random effects models. I like calling them linear mixed models. So the extension of these models to logistic, to Poisson, or to other types of models for different outcomes is usually called generalized linear mixed models. And they are called like this because they are essentially the combination of linear mixed models, which is what you just have seen, the multi-level models, and generalized linear models. Generalized linear models are essentially your regular logistic regression, your regular Poisson regression, etc. Okay, so in generalized linear models, if you remember, the key idea of generalized linear models is that you have three elements to each of these models. You have a probability distribution, which essentially how your outcome behaves. So if you have a normally distributed continuous variable, you will use a Gaussian probability distribution. If you have a variable that is binary, either 0 or 1, for example, someone with diabetes versus someone without diabetes, then you will use a binomial probability distribution. You have a variable that are counts, for example, number of deaths in a city, or number of deaths in a neighborhood, then you will use a Poisson probability distribution. The second element that a generalized linear model has is a linear prediction. And this is essentially what you have been seeing up until now. All of those coefficients that describe the mean of your outcome and that describe the effect of covariance. And then finally, what we call a link function. Link functions are essentially how do you transform your outcome variable so that you can link it to your linear prediction. For example, in linear, not here, here. In linear regression, the probability distribution is the normal distribution, also known as Gaussian. The linear prediction is just your covariance, whatever covariance you add to the model, and the link function is what we call identity, which means we don't do anything with it. Okay, that's just regular linear model. Now, if you want to do a logistic model, then the probability distribution is what is usually called Bernoulli, which in some software is also called a binomial, and that's just telling you that the probability of your outcome is given by this distribution, which has some specific statistical properties. We won't go into that. Importantly, the way you connect your covariance to your outcome is through what we call the log odds. And this is why when you do a logistic regression, you end up talking about odds ratios. Because what you are doing here is converting the probability of something into the odds of that thing, which are equal to the probability over 1 minus the probability, and then you take the log of that. And the only reason why you do this is that so that it behaves in a way that allows you to connect it to the linear prediction of the model. Now, when you do a Poisson, it's what the probability distribution is the Poisson distribution, which has its own properties. We won't go into them. And then the way you link your covariance to that outcome is through a log transformation. So, as an example of what type of outcomes you will use in each one of these models. For linear models, again, are models that are used for continuous variables that are normally distributed. You can use them for things like body mass index, for life expectancy. You can use them for mortality rates with some caveats that we'll talk about in the labs. They will be the simplest model you could do for that. In the case of the logistic model, you will use that for binary variables, that is variables that have two categories, either exposed or unexposed, or with the outcome or not with the outcome, etc. That could be things like such as diabetes or hypertension. And the Poisson model, again, you will use for things that are counts. So things that are discrete things, you can have 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things, 5 things, 150 things. And in our case, that will be most cases, that will be deaths. And you can use Poisson models to model mortality rates in a way that is more precise and statistically more rigorous than doing it with a linear model. We'll explore the 2 ways of doing that in the labs there. Okay. So how do we connect these generalized linear models with the multi-level models? So the big difference here comes at the first level equation. In the first level equation, instead of having what we had before, which is Yij equals that linear prediction, what we have is that we need to change that. We need to change it to reflect the fact that our outcome is different. It's not a normally distributed continuous variable. It's either a binary variable or counts. So in the case of the logistic generalized linear mixed model, what we end up modeling are the log odds of diabetes, the log odds of hypertension, and for the Poisson, we model the mean of the counts. Now, the key thing here is that the second level, the contextual level, the level of the neighborhood, or the level of the country, or the level of the city, depending on your data structure, is the same thing you saw before. There is no change at all there. So, for level 1, in the case of Poisson, in the case of logistic model, at the end, your level 1 equation looks something like this equation here, in which you model the log odds of the probability of diabetes, for example, which are equal to a neighborhood level intercept and then the effect of a covariance, whatever covariance you want to include here. Now, same thing as before, the level 2 has no change at all. This B0J, which will be the neighborhood level mean of BMI in the linear model, in this case, it will be the neighborhood level log odds of diabetes, is the same thing as before. It's equal to the overall mean, this gamma 00, same thing as what we saw before, plus a deviation from there. Okay, and that is distributed the same way it was distributed before, normally with variance with mean 0 and variance tau 00. Okay, at the second level there is no change at all, and you can even combine level 1 and level 2, ending up with the final most basic model here. Now you may see there may be a tricky thing here. Let me see. Remember before in the linear model how we had a residual here on the right that had a distribution that was normal with mean 0 and variance sigma squared? Well, we no longer have that because logistic models, the generalized linear logistic model, doesn't have that kind of residual because it doesn't have its own variance. So the variance of a logistic model is a function of the probability of the outcome. So how do we calculate the ICC here? That's a tricky thing. That's a tricky thing that really has not exactly a clear answer. There are approximations of it. So if you look at the level 1 equation, that level 1 variance, that as I said depends on the probability of the outcome, is on the probability scale. So this is a probability and that's a probability. Now the second level equation is on the logistic scale because it's telling us how much do the log odds of diabetes vary between neighborhoods. So given that, we cannot mix two scales, so we cannot just go and do an ICC here. So there are two solutions to calculate an ICC and to know how much clustering there is of diabetes at the neighborhood level. The first one is an approximation which basically you convert the level 1 variance to an approximation. So you essentially will calculate the ICC as tau 00 over tau 00 plus 3.29. If you want to know more about why this is the case, one of the papers that we have linked in the syllabus has a more mathematical explanation of this. This is an approximation of the ICC. It will tell us how much variability there is between neighborhoods, but it's an approximation. The other way you can look at it is by looking at the median odds ratio. What the median odds ratio essentially is telling you is how similar are people in a neighborhood compared to people in the same neighborhood as compared to people in other neighborhoods. So what we saw before, how similar are you to the people that live close to you versus to the people that live elsewhere. The median odds ratio is a way you can calculate that. Again, you can go into the Merlo paper, which is linked in the syllabus, and it's in that folder when you have all of the papers and if you want more of the statistical details behind that. But just know that calculating ICCs in a logistic model is not straightforward. You can either approximate it with this formula here, or you can calculate the median odds ratio. Okay, I won't go into the details of the median odds ratio, but at the end it tells you that how similar are people that are in the same group compared to people that are in other groups. Okay. Now, how do you interpret the coefficients in a logistic model? So in a logistic model, as a reminder, this will be the level 1 equation up here, in which you have the log odds of the probability of the outcome are B0J, and then the level 2, which as I said before again, and I will repeat again, is the same thing as the linear model, nothing changes at the second level. It's still a gamma 00 plus the deviation from that gamma 00, and this will be the full model. So in this case, B0J is the neighborhood specific log odds of the outcome, let's say diabetes. So it's for each neighborhood, for each J neighborhood, what is the log odds of the outcome. Gamma 00 will be the log odds of the outcome in the average neighborhood. That is, if you plot all of the neighborhoods, the one that is in the middle. And then U0j is the deviation for each neighborhood from the log odds of the average neighborhood. So how different is each neighborhood, each j neighborhood, from the average one? And as a reminder here of how do you go from log odds to probability, remember that you can back calculate the probability by using the odds. So if you do odds over 1 plus the odds, you can get the probability again, in case you want to convert any of these numbers into a probability. So you want to know in this neighborhood, 13% of the people are diabetic. You will need to go through this formula here. Now, what is the Now, what if we add a covariate here? The previous model had no covariates at all. It only allowed us to see the overall prevalence. So if you add a covariate at the level 1, for example, let's say age, or we say individual level income. So a covariate x1. So you add a covariate at level 1. This is how it looks in the final model. So let me go there. Yes. So what you have is that the covariate, the gamma 10, which is the effect of that covariate of age, let's say, will be the change in the log odds of the outcome, in this case, diabetes for the average neighborhood. Okay, so in this case, it will be again change in log odds of the outcome for each 1 unit increase in age or in other outcome that you want to look, other exposure that you want to look at, such as sex or income or whatever other thing. So it's the change in the log odds of the outcome. Remember, if you exponentiate that, what you get is the odds ratio. Okay, so the exponentiation of this coefficient here will be the odds ratio for that exposure in the average neighborhood. And this is what Anna mentioned before when she said that all of this is conditional on the random effects. That is what we are seeing here. We are saying that this is the effect conditional on the random effects. For the average neighborhood. Okay. Okay. Any question there? And I know this is a lot to get from just a couple hours of lecturing. But believe me, as you read it again and you go over the recording again, it will become more and more clear, and it will become even more clear when we do the labs there. I don't see any hand up. Yes. Go back for a second. Okay. Okay. So the Poisson model is very, very similar to the logistic model in what you need to know, which is that the level 1 equation is different. There is a minor change there, in which instead of doing the log odds, now we do the log of the mean of the counts. Remember that for a Poisson model, you can add an offset for example, the number of people living in the area. And if you do that, then the interpretation of the coefficients is in terms of rates instead of being in terms of counts. So that's why we use the Poisson model a lot for more mortality. So level 1 is this, similar to the logistic one, with this change that we use the log of the counts and that we can add an offset. Level 2, again, as with the logistic model, it doesn't change. It's still the same thing. It's a description of how the random intercept changes and a description of how potentially the effect of a covariate is different between neighborhoods. So very, very similar. And then the interpretation, I won't go into detail about this, but the interpretation of the coefficients is in terms of the ratio of the counts, so how relative to, for example, if we were comparing men and women, relative to women, what is the difference in the counts of men? If you have no offset, if you were to have an offset, such as population, then it will be in terms of a ratio of rates, so a relative risk, what we usually know as a relative risk. Now, what about the variability? What about the measures of variability, the ICC? Well, again, in Poisson models, it's even more complicated. There is no approximation, but there is this median risk ratio. You can look at it in this paper. I won't go into that at all, but it's a way of knowing how similar people are that live in the same neighborhood. Yes, Isabel is asking if it's possible to specify a Poisson model without specifying an offset variable or exposure variable. Yes, it is possible, and the only change is the interpretation. If you have a Poisson model with an offset, imagine that your outcome is mortality counts, and your offset is number of people, then the interpretation of the coefficients is a rate ratio. It's the rate in women is 10% higher than it is in men. If you don't include an offset, then it is the counts. It's a ratio of counts. It's how much higher the counts are in men versus women. Now be careful, because if you are talking about something that is that should be a rate, such as mortality, you should always include the offset, so that you take into consideration. Imagine you were comparing Sao Paulo to Belo Horizonte. Sao Paulo is much bigger, so you need to account for that in the model. Sao Paulo is bound to have a lot higher mortality counts than Belo Horizonte, just because it's bigger. So keep that in mind. So yeah, that's the only change there. And again, in the labs, when we do the both the labs and the model building in Belo Horizonte, we can go into more detail about this interpretation, and we'll say, okay, we'll ask people to say, okay, tell me what is the interpretation of gamma 10. In the case of a Poisson model that has an offset, that will be the rate ratio per 1 unit increase in that covariance, in this case x1. Okay. Any more questions about logistic or Poisson? The summary with logistic or Poisson is basically that 3 things. One, that statistically they are different to the linear model, but this is the same thing you will encounter in a regular logistic or a regular Poisson model. 2, that the ICC is calculated, ICC or other measures of variability are calculated in different ways, and they are mostly approximations or other measures. And 3, that they are more computationally, they require a lot more power. You will notice when you run one of these models, it takes way longer to run than a linear model. Linear models are much more simpler in a multi-level model. So if you have a continuous variable, I will suggest that you use it as continuous whenever you can, and avoid having binary outcomes, because these models are way more complicated than the linear model. Okay, there are a lot of caveats in them that again we'll go over in Belo Horizonte, but just so you know, they are a little bit more complicated. Any other question? Let me go to the yes, this. So as a summary again, we've looked today at why we need linear models, why we need multi-level models, why it is important to have them, what are the consequences of ignoring the multi-level structure, and then what are the uses. With the 2 main uses we've gone over are understanding how the variability occurs at different levels, and how adding variable affects that variability and how you can interpret that, and then do hypothesis testing about the effects of covariance. And then we've also taken a brief look at how you build these models, how you extend them to longitudinal models, or how you extend them to logistic or Poisson models, which are used for binary or counts data. Santiago, did you have any question?
No.
Oh, I heard something. Sorry. Okay. So, does anyone have any question about any of the parts we've talked about today? And again, the webinar will be sent again as a recording. You have the slides that I sent yesterday. You have the papers that we sent around with the syllabus. There's a link there, so you can get the papers. Please read them, because they can give you a more calm explanation of how this works. And And then I highly encourage, if you haven't done it yet, that you read the Salurval methods paper, the one that is required reading for the labs, because that can give you an idea of the levels very well. And that is one of the most important things we'll do during the workshop is clarifying levels. And you will see half of you that got feedback. The feedback was clarify the levels. Is it level 1, level 2, level 3, individual? What kind of levels are you interested in? So if no one has any more questions, I'll give you the reminders again. I want to make sure that everyone sees this. And there will be a follow-up email with more complete instructions. You will get a template. That's all you need. The template in which you essentially summarize your research question and the data that is needed. And you will get an example in which you can see what kind of level of detail we are looking at. If you need any more, please look at the syllabus. The syllabus has a paragraph on that and the kind of things that we need to see in that one-page research summary. So please send that by May 10th. The reason why you need to send this early is because I need to prepare that data for the workshop. I need to know what you are going to be using, so that in the workshop we can have a full discussion about your research idea. Isabel is asking, I'm just wondering how we should organize this one-page summary. Should we rethink it, considering the feedback to work with others that have similar ideas? Okay, yes, so two things there. One, organize it as it's in the template. You will get the template with the organization that you have. For those of you that just got feedback about clarifying models and all, clarifying levels and all of that, please take that into consideration. Be very specific. I want this at level 1 AD, I want this at level 3, this is going to be used in individual level data, etc. Those of you that got feedback that included, please consider talking to this other person. We are encouraging that not so much for the workshop, but for your research proposal. But some people sent ideas that were very similar. So if you eventually want to convert that into a proposal that gets sent into Salurval for you to do, it would be good if you collaborate with this person, so that A, you improve the work, and B, you don't discover that this proposal you've been working on for months, someone else sent it before you. Okay, so that's the idea. There is that that you consider working with those people so that you can build a better team, a collaborative team. And in some cases, it's a person from one country that wants to do one thing, and someone from another country wants to do the same thing. You could actually pull all of those resources and collaborate on that. But for the workshop, please make sure you can talk to those people or not. That's up to you in the case of whether you want to incorporate that. Vanessa, Carlos, and Andres are asking if we nest cities within countries, are there variables collected at the country level? So in the syllabus, you have the link to the Salurval codebooks. I don't think we have that many things at the country level. I will confess that I have GDP at the country level in case you want to use that, GDP per capita. So that's at least something that we have for sure. But if you have any questions, you can email the Salurval data email that is on the website, asking about any data that you are not clear about. But GDP is not there, but I will tell you. Don't tell anyone, but I have GDP at the country level. I mean that I will remember this one-page summary so that I can prepare the data. So it's important that I have that data that you need. Okay. Any other question? I saw someone unmute him, but was it Nelson? No. Okay. Any other question? No. Okay. In a 3-level structured data, how many L2 cases will be to justify the use of level 3? That's a great point. And that's a question that doesn't have a clear answer. There are people that say something around 20 cases, let's say 20 cases per level 3, in order to have something that you can estimate. But in your case, in most surveys, you won't have more than a few cases per level 3. So some people say 20, some people say more. My regular rule of thumb is at least 20 per unit. And that's, that can be, that's flexible actually. There isn't a hard limit. You could have fewer, or you could have more, or you could have very unbalanced cases in which you have a unit with a lot of people and a unit with a lot fewer people. That it truly depends. Just make sure it's not one person per neighborhood, because then it's useless to have that level. Any other question? Please email me with any other concern about your research idea, whether me for the research idea and the Salurbal data email that is on the website for understanding what is and what is not there. Okay, great. 12, so I think it's time to go. Alejandro will send an email with reminders and with a recording and with many other things soon. And yeah, we'll see you in Belo Horizonte.
Chao, gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zama.
Obrigada.
Bye.
Thank you, Sama.
Bye.
Adiós.
Chao, gracias.
Mira, 20 entonces por unidad de anidación y por lo menos.
Okay. Oh, should I stop things here?
Yes.
And close here.
Yeah, you can close that.